She stormed into the hotel room, rain-soaked and furious, only to find her husband surrounded by secrets she never imagined. Then a gun hit the table, and in that split second of rage, everything changed forever. In the sleepy suburban town of Willow Creek, the lives of Emily and Mark Turner appeared picture-perfect to those who watched from afar. Their two-story house, with its white picket fence and flower-laden garden, was the envy of the neighborhood. Mark worked as a financial advisor, his clientele ranging from local businesses to a few larger firms in the city. Emily, a woman with a warm smile and kind eyes, volunteered at the community center, where she ran events for children and supported local charities. They seemed like the ideal couple, but beneath the surface of their well-manicured lives, shadows lurked. It all began a year ago when Mark suddenly developed a passion for fitness. At first, Emily was pleased. Mark had never been one for physical activity, and she thought it was wonderful that he was taking better care of himself. He began going to the gym regularly, every day at 6 p.m. sharp, staying there until late into the evening. He became more disciplined, adopting a healthier diet and building a toned physique that he proudly showed off in front of the mirror each morning. But along with these changes came a growing distance between him and Emily. When Emily asked him about his gym sessions, Mark's responses were always vague. He never mentioned friends or workout partners, yet he seemed to be part of a social circle that she wasn't privy to. He would often come home with the smell of cologne clinging to his clothes, a scent that wasn't his own. His phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, was now always locked and kept in his pocket. At first, Emily tried to brush it off as paranoia, but her unease grew each time he pulled away from her touch, each time he claimed to be too tired to talk. Their once lively dinners turned into quiet affairs, the clinking of cutlery filling the space where their laughter used to be. Emily noticed how he would glance at his phone on the table, a faint smile curling his lips. But when she asked about it, he would fumble, offering excuses that didn't quite add up. Her doubts deepened, creating a chasm between them, one that she could neither bridge nor fully understand. After months of sleepless nights and gnawing anxiety, Emily decided she couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. One chilly autumn evening, as she sat by the fireplace, she made the decision to hire a private investigator. She found Thomas Hayes through a discreet recommendation from a friend. He was known for his ability to dig deep without leaving a trace, a man who could uncover secrets that others missed. Their first meeting took place in Thomas's small, cluttered office on the edge of town. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the walls lined with framed clippings from his past cases. Thomas himself was a man who seemed as worn as the leather chair he sat in, gray stubble on his chin, dark eyes that rarely gave away his thoughts. When Emily entered, he offered her a seat and listened intently as she poured out her suspicions, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. Thomas asked her for details about Mark's schedule, his behavior, and the changes she had noticed over the past year. As she spoke, he took notes, his expression thoughtful but inscrutable. After she finished, he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his chest. "Mrs. Turner," he said in his low, gravelly voice, "I'll look into your husband's activities, but I need you to understand that what I find might not be easy to hear. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Emily's heart clenched at his words, but she nodded. She had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The following weeks passed in a blur. Thomas followed Mark from the gym to various locations around town, keeping his distance while observing his movements. Mark's gym visits, he noticed, weren't just about exercise. He often lingered in the locker room or slipped away into a private section of the gym, where a small, unmarked door led to a back room. The room wasn't on the official gym blueprint, and its windows were always shuttered. Thomas discovered that Mark met with a select group of men, each of them arriving at staggered times to avoid drawing attention. They spoke in low voices, their conversations hushed and laden with an air of secrecy. Thomas managed to get a few photographs of Mark entering and leaving the room, but the meetings remained a mystery until one night when he followed Mark to a small boutique hotel downtown. It was there that Thomas pieced together the truth. Through careful observation and discreet conversations with hotel staff, he learned that Mark's group wasn't just a gathering of friends. They were a support group for men exploring their sexuality, a hidden circle that provided a safe space for those who couldn't be open in their everyday lives. The realization left Thomas conflicted. He understood the need for such spaces, but he also saw the inevitable pain that would come when Emily learned the truth. The next morning, Thomas called Emily to his office. He laid out the photos and notes in front of her, explaining everything he had uncovered. As she took in the evidence, Emily's face paled, her hands trembling as she traced the outline of Mark's figure in the photographs. Her mind raced through the implications of this revelation. Years of marriage, countless shared moments, all shadowed by a secret she never imagined. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would he hide this from me?" Thomas had no answers, only a quiet understanding of her pain. He watched as Emily's grief gave way to anger, her eyes blazing with a determination he hadn't seen before. She demanded more details, wanting to confront Mark, to force him to face what he had kept hidden. Thomas tried to calm her, urging her to take time to process everything. But Emily was beyond reason. She was a woman on the brink, her emotions a tangled web of betrayal and hurt. That night, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the weight of the truth pressed down on her. Her thoughts circled back to Mark, his distant smiles, the cologne that wasn't his, the way he had slipped away from her touch. She remembered the vows they had exchanged, the promises they had made, and the life they had built together. But now, those memories were tainted, each one unraveling like a thread pulled loose from a tightly woven tapestry. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Emily made up her mind. She would confront Mark, face him with the truth he had hidden. She couldn't live with the lies any longer, couldn't continue to be the unsuspecting wife in a marriage built on deception. Little did she know, the confrontation she sought would lead to a tragedy that no one could have foreseen, a chain of events that would leave her life, and the lives of those around her, irreparably changed. And as she prepared to face the man she thought she knew, a dark sense of foreboding settled in her chest, a whisper of the storm that was yet to come. The days leading up to the confrontation were a blur of tension and anxiety for Emily. Each moment she spent in their home felt like an excruciating lie. She moved through her daily routines as if on autopilot, watering the plants, arranging the kitchen shelves, preparing meals that she and Mark barely touched. But beneath the surface, her emotions churned like a storm ready to break. Every glance Mark gave her, every smile he offered, felt like another layer of deception, deepening the wound that had festered since she uncovered the truth. Thomas, too, felt the weight of what he had set into motion. He had become invested in Emily's plight, seeing more than just another client in her haunted eyes and trembling voice. Against his better judgment, he had grown attached to her, feeling a sense of responsibility not only for the investigation, but for the unraveling of her life. He knew that the confrontation she was determined to have could end disastrously, but he couldn't bring himself to stop her. There was a part of him, perhaps the part that still believed in some form of justice, that thought maybe Emily needed this confrontation to find closure. On a rainy evening, Thomas called Emily with news that Mark's group was holding another private gathering at a hotel downtown. He could hear the urgency in her voice when she answered, and he told her the details before she hung up abruptly. He knew that she was on her way to the hotel, and a pit formed in his stomach as he realized how unpredictable the situation might become. Driven by a sense of duty and something more personal that he didn't dare to name, he decided to follow her, hoping he might be able to prevent things from getting out of hand. When Emily arrived at the hotel, the rain was pouring down in sheets, drenching her as she hurried inside. Her hands were trembling as she clutched the strap of her purse, feeling the weight of every emotion that had built up inside her over the past year. She found the room where Mark and his group had gathered, room 214, tucked away at the end of a long corridor. Without hesitation, she burst through the door, her entrance startling the group of men who were seated around a table. Mark's expression shifted from shock to dread as he locked eyes with Emily. The room fell into a tense silence, the air thick with the unspoken truth that hung between them. Emily's anger erupted like a dam breaking, her words tumbling out in a flood of accusations and questions. She shouted at Mark, demanding to know why he had kept this part of his life hidden from her, why he had allowed her to live in ignorance while he maintained a secret life. Mark tried to speak, stumbling over his words as he attempted to explain himself, but Emily's fury drowned him out. Her voice was raw with hurt as she recounted all the moments she had doubted herself, all the nights she had spent wondering what she had done wrong. Her words lashed out at him, accusing him of betrayal, of breaking their vows, of building a life on lies. The men around the table watched in silence, their faces a mixture of sympathy and unease. Mark finally raised his hands, his own voice breaking as he tried to reason with her. He confessed to the years of confusion he had felt, the fear of rejection, the isolation that had driven him to hide this part of himself. He spoke of the support he had found in the group, how it had given him a sense of belonging that he had never felt before. But to Emily, it all sounded like excuses, like empty words that couldn't undo the hurt he had caused. As their argument escalated, the tension in the room reached a boiling point. One of the men, a tall, muscular figure with a hardened expression, stood up, trying to calm Emily down. But his attempt only seemed to fuel her anger further. In the chaos, he reached into his bag and pulled out a handgun, placing it on the table with a thud. His intention was clear. He wanted to use it as a symbol of authority, a means to defuse the escalating scene. But instead, it had the opposite effect. Emily's eyes went wide as she saw the gun, her mind flashing through a whirlwind of emotions, fear, anger, betrayal, and a desperate need to regain control. In a moment of impulsive rage, she lunged for the gun, grabbing it with shaking hands. Her vision blurred as she pointed the weapon, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Stay back!" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. The men around the table froze, fear spreading across their faces. Mark took a step toward her, his hands raised, his face a mask of desperation. "Emily, please, put it down," he pleaded, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." But his words only fueled her anger further. Her grip on the gun tightened, her mind clouded with a painful mix of memories. Their wedding day, the promises they had made, the night she had waited for him to come home, oblivious to the secrets he kept. All of it seemed to blur together. And in a split second of blinding rage, her fingers squeezed the trigger. The deafening crack of the gunshot echoed through the room, followed by a stunned silence. Mark crumpled to the floor, clutching his chest where the bullet had struck. Blood blossomed through his shirt, his face contorted in pain as he collapsed. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening as she stared at the scene in front of her, the gun slipping from her grasp. Time seemed to slow as the realization of what she had done sank in. Her knees gave out, and she sank to the floor beside Mark, her hands hovering over his body, her mind reeling. She reached out, cradling his head in her lap, her tears falling onto his pale face. "Mark, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," she sobbed, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean... But Mark's breathing was already growing shallow, his eyes unfocused as he struggled to hold on. Thomas, who had arrived moments before the shot rang out, rushed into the room, taking in the scene with a sinking heart. He grabbed the gun from where it had fallen, his hands steady even as his mind raced with the gravity of the situation. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, a chilling reminder of the consequences that would follow. Thomas knelt beside Emily, trying to pull her away from Mark's body, but she clung to him, her sobs tearing through the air. By the time the police burst into the room, the scene was one of chaos and heartbreak. Mark's lifeless body on the floor, Emily cradling him, her face streaked with tears, and Thomas standing nearby, the gun in his hand. The police officers shouted commands, their guns drawn, ordering everyone to the ground. Thomas quickly complied, dropping the weapon and raising his hands, his expression grim. But Emily seemed oblivious to their presence, her grief swallowing her whole. It took 2 officers to pull her away from Mark's body, her cries of anguish echoing through the hallway as they handcuffed her. As she was led away, Thomas watched her with a sense of helplessness, knowing that no matter what he said, the evidence was stacked against her. Her fingerprints were on the gun. The witnesses had seen her grab the weapon in a fit of rage, and the bullet that had killed Mark had come from her hands. Despite everything, she was the one who would bear the blame for what had happened. Thomas tried to speak on her behalf at the station, explaining the circumstances that had led to the tragic outcome, but his words fell on deaf ears. The case was clear-cut in the eyes of the law. Emily had killed her husband, and nothing could change that. The trial that followed was a media circus, drawing attention from across the state. Reporters painted Emily as a vengeful wife who had snapped after discovering her husband's secret life. They dug up details from their past, twisting their story into a sensational narrative of betrayal and violence. Emily's friends, once a source of support, turned away, unable to understand the depth of her grief or the circumstances that had led to the fateful night. Throughout the trial, Thomas sat in the back of the courtroom, watching the woman he had grown to care for being judged by a jury that saw only the surface of the tragedy. He struggled with his own guilt, knowing that if he had acted differently, if he had intervened sooner or left the gun where it fell, the outcome might have been different. But there was no way to turn back time, no way to change the course of events that had unfolded. Emily was ultimately found guilty of manslaughter, sentenced to several years in prison for taking a life. She stood silent as the verdict was read, her eyes hollow, her spirit crushed under the weight of her guilt and sorrow. And as she was led away in handcuffs, she cast one last glance back at Thomas, a fleeting look that spoke of everything they had lost, of a life that could never be reclaimed. In the months that followed Emily's conviction, the events of that fateful night left a lasting scar on everyone involved. The town of Willow Creek became a place of whispered rumors and pointed stares, its residents drawn into the tragedy that had shattered the Turner household. People speculated about Mark's hidden life and Emily's sudden turn to violence. It became a story they told over dinner or discussed in hushed tones at the grocery store, never really understanding the layers of pain and loss beneath the sensational headlines. Emily's time in prison was marked by a sense of numbness that settled over her like a heavy fog. Her days were filled with monotonous routines, meals, chores, and nights spent in a narrow bed with nothing but her thoughts for company. The faces of Mark and Thomas haunted her dreams, blending with memories of the life she once had. She replayed the events of that night over and over, dissecting each moment, wondering if there was a way she could have stopped herself, if she could have found the strength to hold back her anger before it destroyed everything. At first, she couldn't bring herself to accept the letters Thomas sent her. They sat unopened on the small metal desk in her cell, each one a reminder of the man who had witnessed her descent into darkness. But as the weeks turned into months, curiosity and a lingering sense of connection drove her to open the first envelope. Inside, she found not just words, but a glimpse into Thomas's own struggle with what had happened. He wrote of his guilt, of how he felt he had failed her, of the ways he tried to make sense of the choices they had both made. His letters became a lifeline in those long, lonely nights. He spoke of the life he had led before becoming a detective, of his own broken relationships and his struggle to find meaning in a world that often seemed indifferent to suffering. And through his words, Emily began to see him in a new light, not as a detached investigator who had uncovered Mark's secrets, but as a man burdened by his own regrets. In her replies, Emily opened up about the pain she felt, the love she still held for Mark despite everything, and the crushing weight of her guilt. She wrote of the fear she faced each morning when she woke up to the stark reality of her new life, and the memories that clung to her like a shroud. In sharing these thoughts with Thomas, she found a strange sense of solace, as if their shared grief could build a bridge between their broken worlds. Thomas, on the outside, struggled with his own role in the tragedy. He had left the private investigation business after the trial, unable to continue a career that now felt tainted by his failure to prevent the disaster. He took up work as a security guard in a quiet part of town, his nights filled with the steady rhythm of patrolling empty corridors, giving him time to think about everything that had gone wrong. He visited Emily once a month, sitting across from her in the visitor's room, their conversations tinged with sadness, but also a growing sense of understanding. Their connection deepened slowly, in the way that two people might learn to lean on each other when the world around them has fallen apart. Thomas came to realize that Emily was more than the woman accused of killing her husband. She was someone trying to make sense of a life turned upside down, someone who had been pushed to the edge and found herself standing alone in the aftermath. And Emily, in turn, saw in Thomas a man who shared her sense of loss, who had been as caught up in the tragedy as she had, even if their roles had been different. But despite their growing bond, the shadow of Mark's death loomed over them both. Every visit, every letter carried the weight of what had happened, the memory of the gunshot that had changed everything. They danced around the topic, never quite speaking of the darkest parts of that night, as if voicing them might make the pain sharper, more real. As the seasons changed, so too did Emily's time in prison. She earned the respect of a few guards and fellow inmates, volunteering for jobs in the prison library and teaching literacy classes to those who needed it. She began to find small moments of peace in the routine, though she knew she would never fully escape the weight of her guilt. The tragedy of that night still lived inside her, but it no longer consumed her every waking thought. And through Thomas's letters and visits, she found a thread of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, she could still find a way to atone for what had happened. It was during one of Thomas's visits, nearly a year after the trial, that Emily finally broached the subject they had both avoided for so long. They sat across from each other in the visitor's room, the air thick with unspoken words. Emily's hands, calloused from prison work, rested on the table between them, and she looked up at Thomas with a gaze that seemed to pierce through his guarded expression. "Do you think I'm a monster?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The question had lingered in her mind for months, eating away at her, and she couldn't hold it back any longer. Thomas was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. He had asked himself the same question many times, wondering how someone like Emily could have committed such an act, and whether he had misjudged her character from the start. But as he looked at her now, he saw not the rage that had driven her to pick up the gun, but the sorrow that had followed. "No," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "You're not a monster, Emily. You're human. You made a mistake, a terrible one, but that doesn't define you. I wish I had done more to stop it, to keep things from going so wrong. But I don't think you're beyond redemption." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she managed a small, trembling smile. It wasn't absolution. She knew that she would carry the guilt for the rest of her life, but it was a step toward forgiving herself, a small light in the darkness that had consumed her. She reached across the table, her hand brushing against Thomas's, and for a moment, they sat there in silence, sharing the fragile connection that had grown between them. As time went on, Thomas began to consider what might happen after Emily's release. If she could ever truly find a new path in life, he knew it wouldn't be easy. Her past would follow her wherever she went, and she would face judgment from those who couldn't understand the complexity of what had happened. But he also believed that she deserved a chance to rebuild, to find some semblance of peace. And he realized that he wanted to be a part of that journey, to help her find her way back to a world that had become a stranger to her. 2 years later, Emily was granted parole for good behavior. Her release was a quiet affair, with no reporters outside the gates and no family waiting to welcome her back. She stepped out into a world that felt both familiar and strange, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what she had left behind. But standing there at the edge of the prison grounds, she found Thomas waiting for her, leaning against his old car with a small, uncertain smile on his face. Their first moments together outside the prison walls were awkward, both of them unsure how to navigate the shift from letters and prison visits to the reality of freedom. But as they drove away from the facility, with the road stretching out before them, they spoke of small things, of the places they might visit, the job opportunities Thomas had found for her, and the possibility of starting over. They spent the next few months in a quiet corner of the state, far from the prying eyes of Willow Creek. Thomas helped Emily find work at a local bookstore, where she spent her days surrounded by the stories that had once provided her with an escape during her time in prison. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch of their small rented house, watching the sun dip below the horizon, sharing moments of silence and conversations that ranged from the mundane to the deeply personal. Their relationship wasn't easy. They both carried scars that couldn't be erased, and there were days when the weight of the past seemed too much to bear. But they also found comfort in each other's presence, a sense of understanding that went beyond words. They never quite defined what they had, whether it was love, companionship, or something in between, but they held on to it as tightly as they could, knowing how fragile it was. One chilly evening, as they sat together on the porch, Thomas turned to Emily, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think we'll ever find peace with what happened?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. Emily looked out at the fading light, her breath visible in the cool air. She considered his question for a long moment before answering. "I don't know if we'll ever find peace. Not completely. But maybe we can find a way to live with it, to make something better out of what's left." Thomas nodded, and they fell into a comfortable silence, listening to the distant sounds of the forest that surrounded their new home. In that moment, they both understood that their story didn't have a perfect ending, but it had a chance for something more, something built on the ashes of the past, fragile yet real. As the night deepened, they sat together, facing an uncertain future, but finding strength in each other's presence. And though the shadows of their shared tragedy would never fully disappear, they clung to the hope that they could create a new life out of the darkness, a life where redemption, however imperfect, was possible.